All right, today we're diving into one of the most controversial topics in Christian history, indulgences. We're going to unpack what they were, where they came from, and how this one practice might just be a symptom of a much, much bigger story. Let's get into it.
So get this, this was an actual sales pitch attributed to a guy named Johann Tetzel back in the 16th century. It's kind of shocking to hear, right? It makes salvation sound like something you can just buy at a store. And that one phrase, wow, it perfectly captures the controversy that would help light the fuse of the Protestant Reformation.
And that's really the big question for us today. I mean, how on earth did an act of spiritual mercy get turned into a full-blown business? Well, we're going to follow the historical breadcrumbs and see exactly how a spiritual idea ended up with a price tag.
Okay, so first things first, let's get right to the heart of this whole controversy. What were indulgences even supposed to be? And how did they go from being an act of mercy to a business that, basically tore the Christian world in two?
So you got to understand, the original idea in the early church was actually pretty reasonable. It went like this. Even after God forgives your sin, there's still a kind of earthly consequence, a temporal penalty. Think about it this way. If you accidentally break your neighbor's window and they forgive you, you still got to fix the window, right? An indulgence was the church's way of helping you fix the window, through things like prayer or fasting. So the original intent, it was genuinely merciful.
But as this timeline shows, things started to spiral. What began as spiritual acts, well, it evolved. By the Middle Ages, you could get an indulgence for donating to a big cause, like the Crusades. Okay, but a few centuries later, the system became totally commercialized. The money part wasn't subtle anymore. It was the whole point. And that is what set off Martin Luther. Eventually, things got so out of hand that the Catholic Church itself, at the Council of Trent, had to step in and condemn the sale of indulgences, admitting how corrupt it had become.
And this slide hits on a really crucial distinction that the source makes, the difference between biblical tithing and the business of selling indulgences. Tithing, you see, is presented as a scriptural idea, a free will offering to support the church. But the sale of indulgences, at its worst, that was something else entirely. It was a straight-up transaction based on church tradition, not scripture, where mercy was treated like a product on a shelf.
So that begs the question, if the practice got so twisted, where did the idea even come from in the first place? Was it hiding somewhere in the Bible, or did it pop up from somewhere else?
And this is really the million-dollar question, isn't it? The short answer from our source material is a pretty clear no. Not directly anyway. You can't flip to a chapter and verse in the Bible that lays out a system for indulgences. But how the theological argument for it got built is a little more complicated.
See, the defenders of the practice didn't just pull it out of thin air. The source shows how they were kind of like theological lawyers, piecing together different verses to build a case. They'd point to the church's authority to bind and loose, to the apostles' power to forgive sins, to the story of King David, who still had to face consequences even after God forgave him, and even this idea that one Christian's good deeds could help another. But the key thing here is that these were all interpretations. They were theological building blocks used to construct a system, not a blueprint for one.
So if not the Bible, then where? Well, here's the real origin according to the source. The practice didn't start with Scripture, but with the very human experience of the early church a couple of centuries after the apostles. In times of brutal persecution, a belief started to grow that martyrs, people who died for their faith, had this surplus of spiritual merit. And it was thought that this merit could be shared to help out other Christians who had stumbled. It's a really powerful idea, born from empathy and crisis, but it's a tradition, not a direct command from Scripture.
And this brings us to the absolute core argument of our source material, that indulgences aren't just some isolated mistake. Instead, they're a huge symptom of a much bigger shift in Christianity, what the source calls a great drift away from direct divine guidance and toward human logic and tradition. The source points to one single critical moment in history, the death of the last of Jesus' original apostles, around the year 100 AD. The argument is that when they were gone, that direct line for ongoing revelation from God, it closed. And into that huge void, the church had to pour something new: human wisdom, councils, debates, philosophy, human reasoning.
And this quote from Isaiah really captures the problem that the source identifies. When human beings try to figure out divine questions with human tools, there's always going to be a gap. This verse is used to make a really sharp point. Human reasoning, no matter how brilliant or sincere, just isn't the same thing as getting the answer straight from God.
Now, to show that this great drift wasn't just a one-time thing, the source uses indulgences as Exhibit A. But then it points to a totally different core Christian doctrine and argues that there's a clear, repeatable pattern at play here.
Okay, this table is pretty much the source's entire argument in a nutshell. It's really fascinating. It claims that two completely different doctrines, indulgences and the Trinity, were built using the exact same man-made process. Let's walk through it. For both, you start with a basic biblical idea. Then you run into a tough question that the Bible doesn't spell out an answer for. So what method do you use to solve it? Not new revelation, but human tools, reasoning, tradition, philosophy. And what's the end result in both cases? A complex, man-made system that goes way beyond the simple original teaching.
This flowchart basically turns that pattern into a domino effect. It argues that losing the apostles leads directly to losing revelation. Human reasoning then rushes in to fill that gap, which creates new traditions. Over time, those man-made traditions start to become more important than the original gospel, leading to what the source calls widespread corruption and apostasy. And this timeline just maps that whole process out visually. The source uses colors to show the change. The green era, that's the original church, led by living apostles and revelation. Yellow is the falling away, right after the apostles are gone, when human traditions like the first ideas about indulgences start to creep in. And finally, red is the stage of corruption, where major councils make these new, man-made doctrines official.
So after going through all this history, this entire analysis leads to one final, really powerful conclusion from the source. Given this whole pattern of drift, what was the only real solution?
And this is where it all lands. The whole argument boils down to these 5 points. The original church had apostles and revelation. When they were gone, human reasoning took over. That led to new doctrines, like indulgences, that weren't there in the beginning. Eventually, these new traditions buried the original gospel, and because of that, the source argues, the problem was too deep for a simple reformation, just trimming the bad branches. It required a full restoration, going back to the very beginning and planting the original seed all over again.
Which leaves all of us with a really big question to think about. When a new tradition gets added to an original blueprint, is it a helpful innovation that makes it better, or is it an error that changes it into something it was never meant to be? That's the question at the heart of it all.